You are listening to the serialized audiobook podcast for Blood of the Stars, an epic fantasy novel written by Karyne Norton, read by Paeter Frandsen and Karyne Norton. If you can't wait to listen to the whole audiobook, or if you want a signed physical copy, go to karynnorton.com/shop to get the lowest cost by buying direct. You can also find the audiobook on Audible, Barnes & Noble, and other standard retailers. Please enjoy the next installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton. Chapter 44. Aura rode Walnut, but kept her eyes closed, watching the events play out in her mind as if she were present for them all. Islara's eastern gate was almost in view, but she was still up on the forested ridge, slowly making her way around the destroyed valley. Aura had seen Karyne and Riverin rush out the southern gate. She'd sensed more than heard Durakan long before she'd caught his shadow. It had all happened faster than Aura had expected. And yet, as it happened, the possible paths grew narrower. When Karyne had run back, she'd smiled at his perfect timing. He wasn't a mere boat or lily pad needing to be placed in the path of a ripple. He was a stone, about to create a new ripple. One that might form a tidal wave as massive as her own. Only this time, she sensed the sun sanctioning it. Now, Skunk came up behind her, huffing as if he'd worked hard to catch up. Aura opened her eyes and hummed her disapproval. She pulled Walnut up short, then reached for Skunk's reins. "He needs you. You know that, right?" she murmured. The horse whinnied, pulling against her grip. "Yes, you knew. Now, go get him. Go get Karyne." She dropped the reins and let Skunk go free. Aura smiled as the gelding disappeared down the trail leading to the eastern gate. This is how we put things in the paths of ripples.
Chapter 45. Karyne held his breath as the fearless woman left her hand on Durakan's snout, eyes closed as if she fully trusted that the beast wouldn't snap her hand or head right off. Her long brown locks blew out around her in the breeze of the dragon's breath, like she was a star dancing in the wind, her cheeks pink with the heat of it. In the mere moments he'd been watching, she'd stepped forward, eyes fierce with determination and a steadiness that held more courage than any man he'd seen preparing for a pirate's skirmish. This couldn't be Daisy. Karyne shifted in the rubble where he hid, his gaze scanning the rest of her companions, but the only other woman whose age seemed right had short black braids and an upturned nose. Enla's description came back to him: russet brown waves, piercing green eyes, regal grace. The woman attempting to tame a dragon was a perfect match in one sense, but in another she was all wrong. Daisy had been a child, an innocent toddler who needed saving, someone he was ready to scoop up and dash to safety. This woman did not need saving. The complexity and confusion surrounding her entire identity left him frozen in fascination, allowing him to catch her small gasp when her eyes went wide. She dropped her hand and took several steps back, muttering something only for Durakan's ears. The steps back were all her companions needed. A volley of arrows came from the edges of the square. A man nearly knocked Daisy to the ground in his effort to drag her away. The dragon roared, spreading his wings, but the sound died off to a whimper as his sliced wings shuddered. He turned to the side, directing fire at two people on the north side of the square. One had to be an advanced progeny, because a wave of water doused the line of fire, including the dragon's snout. The dragon backed away, inching closer to where Karyne hid. They'd grounded Durakan. Karyne almost laughed with his shock, but then the beast's tail swung, forcing Karyne to scramble backward before it crushed the place he'd been hiding. He made his way through the back of the building until he came out farther east, nearer to the group protecting Daisy. A surge of disappointment flooded through him, leaving him mortified at his petty thoughts. He'd wanted to save her. He'd failed when he was young, and this was his chance to put things right. Only he'd been stupid enough to think she was still like the child in his memory, incapable of protecting herself and without aid from others. He'd been a fool. Somehow, he suspected Aura knew all this, and it made him feel like an even bigger fool. By the time he rounded the buildings to the eastern gate and caught sight of Daisy's group again, half of them were missing. Had they left through the gate? Would they attack Karyne if he went out the same way? Daisy and a much older man remained, both holding out their hands as if to ward off the advancing dragon. A couple of others picked their way through the rubble, everyone taking care not to anger the dragon further. Karyne frowned. This time Daisy looked smaller, weaker. Had he imagined her strength and courage before? Or had the balance shifted that quickly? Maybe the magic she'd used was too much for her. Even her skin seemed paler. He hesitated, watching as the dragon drew closer. Maybe she did need help. He debated what he might do, but the older man's molten staff seemed far more useful than Karyne's ability to steal memories. Even his skill with a sword was useless against the scales of a dragon. A noise behind him made him start, and when he turned, a horse nuzzled his cheek. "Skunk?" Karyne glanced up at the ridge, but there was no sign of Riverin or Aura. "You're a good boy, aren't you?" he murmured, glancing back at Daisy and her companion. The dragon had nearly reached them, and this time Durakan snarled, sure to bite off any hand held out to him. Did Daisy know that? Or would she reach out again anyway? He couldn't risk it. Maybe she hadn't needed saving before, but she clearly needed it now. He launched onto Skunk's back, then kicked the horse with his heels, rushing for Daisy. When he drew close, he had a moment of panic, recognizing that the dragon could easily take him out before he ever reached Daisy. He imagined Enla having seen this potential future, having hoped it wouldn't happen. He could hear her telling people afterward, explaining how Karyne's pride was the thing that had taken him out in the end. His progeny mentors had always taught him that courage without fear was pride. The only time one wounded Karyne in a duel was because he was proving that very point. Which was why Karyne knew Enla would be wrong in her assessment. It couldn't be pride rushing him closer to death, because he was terrified. Durakan's gaze snapped to Karyne, the beast's eyes narrowing. As Karyne reached Daisy, the beast opened his mouth. Karyne leaned over, grabbing on to Daisy by the arm and yanking her up over his horse. She screamed in protest, but it sounded like she spoke the name of her companion. Karyne felt the heat of Durakan's breath, the roar of fire erupting behind him. He didn't look back to see if Daisy's friend survived. She twisted on top of the horse, attempting to pull herself upright on the horse. "You're an idiot! I can't believe you interfered like that!" His mouth swung open, and his fear flipped to irritation. "What? I just saved your life!" Skunk practically flew through the eastern gate in his rush to escape the dragon. The woman finally got herself seated, as if riding one of Enla's ridiculous side saddles, and the brown waves surrounding her face shifted to short black braids, her upturned nose lifted even higher with her disdain. "You probably killed Silmar. Maybe Eliana, too, not that she really matters." She muttered the last part, forcing Garen to strain to hear her words. "You're not. What happened to Eliana?" The woman eyed him strangely. "The dragon probably just ate her. Who are you, anyway?" They reached the forest line, and the woman launched off the horse's back before Garen could answer her question or come to a full stop. Within moments, he was surrounded by half a dozen armed men and women. When arrows trained on his chest, he held his palms up in surrender as Skunk did a nervous dance. "Well, who are you?" the woman asked again. "And why are you here?" "I'm a friend. I've come to rescue Daisy, daughter of the priestess Emerus." He directed his answer to the woman, but spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "I was charged with her safety over 14 years ago, and I mean to see it through." Admitting the truth out loud felt good, but it also sounded childish, symbolic of the age he'd been when he'd made such a promise. "I recognize you," another woman called out, her voice filled with disdain. "He's Prince Garen of Eleness." The first woman's eyebrows rose, and Garen gave her a sheepish grin. "Doesn't mean I'm your enemy." A man stepped forward, crossing his arms over his vest and nearly bare chest. Fishhooks hung from his ears, and his head looked newly shaven. "Tie him up." Two others rushed to do the man's bidding, pulling Garen down off his horse. "We'll let Silmar decide what to do with him," the man said. "I have 5 silver notes that say he'll feed him to Durakan." The last thing Garen saw before a bag was thrown over his head was the man holding up a webbed hand ready to collect money, and the last thing he heard before losing consciousness was the man's laughter.
Chapter 46. "Run, Eliana!" Silmar's growl forced her head back around to face Durakan, whose flames had barely missed them both. "The dragon will take you to her. Run!" Eliana blinked, shaking her head. She still saw the image of the blur of a man on horseback, stealing away Kendallin, who remained cloaked in Jasperus's illusion. "He can't take me. He can't fly." She held out her shaky right hand once more, the ache in her left shoulder throbbing even worse than before. But now that Kendallin was no longer posing as Eliana, Durakan's wary gaze rested on her. Silmar inched his way to the side, and the dragon flicked a lazy glance the old man's way. "He knows what you're doing," she said. "He's smarter than you think." After seeing his memories, it was clear he wasn't the mindless beast bent on destruction that they'd made him out to be. Silmar didn't respond, just crept his way closer to the dragon, who no longer seemed to mind. It was as if he'd given up when his wings were torn. "Promise me you won't kill him," Eliana begged. Her hand nearly brushed Durakan's snout once more, and the dragon sniffed again, probably unsure if he could trust his eyes after Jasperus's trickery. "He's branded by Mavis, just like my mother. It's not his fault." When Silmar reached for the dragon's side, Durakan jerked upright, growling and snapping as he turned toward his right wing. "No, Durakan!" Eliana reached for his snout, but the beast had already moved. He inhaled deeply, Eliana's only warning for what was to come. She screamed, launching herself at Silmar, who had dropped to the ground. Her sessions of self-defense, healing, and archery came back to her, all a waste in this moment, when none of those things could help. She drew every ounce of energy from her blood, her starlock, even the deep well within her that she was always too afraid to access. Without any place to push it, without any purpose to guide it, she hunched over Silmar and flung it out wildly behind her, unsure if it was her power or Duraken's fire that burned into her back. Bright light flashed, blinding her, but even after the heat and the dragon's roar were gone, the light shone. She and Silmar turned. A shield of light burned between them and Duraken, a wall like glass. It shimmered and faded, but didn't completely disappear. Beneath it, a field of daisies grew, blossoms popping up in a wave around their feet and Duraken's tail. Eliana watched both the light and the flowers, sensing the way they ebbed and flowed with her breaths, like they were tied to her, like they were a part of her. For the first time, the energy within her abated, its end within sight. And for the first time, Eliana worried what it would feel like to not have it. She reached out, tugging back against the flow, struggling to rein it in. But its pull was too hard, the control she'd thought she'd had absent. She could only guide the energy out. So she did, pushing it into the shield until it was bright once more, sending it through the flowers until they grew, twisting unnaturally like vines, taking over the rubble and remains, even crawling up over Duraken's paws. In a panic, he pulled, making the vines snap, but more grew until he tripped and came down with a thud that shook the ground. Silmar bolted forward, straight through the glassy light, placing a hand on Duraken's foreleg. Before Duraken could attack or even assess his enemy, his eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed in a heap against the earth, rattling the few remaining windows of the neighboring homes. The shield collapsed, and Eliana sucked in a shuddering breath, rushing to check the beast, unsure where she would even hear a heartbeat. "Did you kill him?" She ran to the beast's belly, watching for the rise and fall of his chest. When it came, faintly, she sighed out her relief. "I'm not sure I could if I wanted to." Silmar came around from the creature's other side, face pale as he warily eyed Eliana. "Kendallin can sift his soul. See if it gives us answers." Eliana swallowed hard, afraid to ask what Silmar might do once he had his answers. "Is Arvid gone?" she asked. Silmar nodded, his gaze still on the clusters of daisies. "Ran off during the chaos. Hard to say if he'll stick around for vengeance or run back to Mavis." "He'll go back to Mavis." Her voice came out hollow. "Told me I'd be under her power soon." Silmar was instantly alert. "Did he see you do magic?" She shook her head. "I don't think so, but he probably saw the cord of my starlock." She reached for the leather around her neck. Silmar's eyes closed, his face a mask of concentration. When were you going to tell me you can do a shield? The accusation in his voice left her startled. I can't. I haven't been able to before. I didn't know what I was doing. Silmar still stared at her. You shouldn't progress that fast. Your skills should have tapered off when we weaned you, giving you just the one strength on your spoke. The others can be built up, but it takes time and effort. With Aeliana's energy drained, the loss of what had filled her for so many years made her snap. You make me practice every night. I have been putting forth time and effort. Silmar remained unperturbed. And you stopped the blood magic? She glared up at him, then turned on her heel, stomping through the rubble toward the eastern gate. How dare he accuse her of continuing the blood magic? She hadn't wanted to do any magic, and now they'd convinced her to try, and she was suddenly suspect for doing well at it? I've seen the marks on your skin. They're not all old, he called after her. Her anger rose. She didn't know where the fresh cuts came from. She'd started wondering if she did it in her sleep. But that didn't mean she was doing blood magic. It's a temptation that never really goes away, he continued. There's no shame in acknowledging that weakness. But if you've stopped the blood magic like you say, then you've been holding out on us. She stumbled with his words, refusing to be baited. But they still rang in her ears like a memory stuck, repeating. As the sting of the accusation faded, it was replaced with a hollow pang. Silmar hadn't just accused her of doing something evil. He'd suggested they'd all come to trust her, to see her as one of them. And now they couldn't. Lukai waited for her on the other side of the gate, his face relaxing into a slightly less concerned frown when she came in sight. Is Silmar? He's fine. She cut Lukai off, continuing her march past him without another word. Beyond the tree line, Veldin, Iris, Kendallin, and Cyrus anxiously watched the gate. Aeliana singled out Kendallin. Silmar wants you to invade the dragon's soul. Kendallin's eyes narrowed. Sympathizing with the enemy? The dragon isn't our enemy. Mavis is. The others exchanged glances, but no one dared get involved. Kendallin snorted and pushed past Aeliana, heading back into Islara. Aeliana's gaze roamed the others, doing a silent census to make sure everyone was accounted for. Jasperus and Holm were missing, but an extra man sat, slumped against a tree with a sack over his head, and his hands awkwardly tied behind his back. Since when do we take prisoners? Aeliana asked. Veldin shrugged. I'm just waiting until Silmar can talk to him. He claims he's here to protect you. The man they spoke of didn't move. His chin rested oddly on his chest. No tattoos marked his hands, so he wasn't the man from Lover's Falls. Is he unconscious? It's just an herb in one of my seaweeds. Lukai can revive him when Silmar is ready to question him. She knew her friends hadn't mistreated the man, but after reliving Durican's memories, Something about seeing the man tied up left her raw. She stepped forward and pulled off the sack. The man's golden brown hair hung in his eyes, and days-old stubble covered his jaw. She kneeled at his side, lifting his chin to see if he looked remotely familiar. He was younger than she'd first thought, only a few years her senior if she had to guess. His nose had a slight angle, like it had been broken once in his youth. But every other feature seemed perfectly chiseled from marble. Still, he didn't wake. Silmar hadn't been completely wrong. She'd been holding back. She realized that now, after being forced to use her power to its fullest capacity. It hadn't always been intentional. Holding back had been her method of survival for as long as she could remember. She couldn't decide yet if that was a good or bad thing. Even her uncertainty was proof that she'd changed since coming to Vendaris. Before she could evaluate it more, she pulled at the remaining energy in her starlock, drawing it through her arm and into her good hand where it held the man's chin. Her starlock grew warm, and then cold as the energy drained. She fed it to him, not knowing if it would work, but eager to try. The others might be content waiting for Lukai and Silmar, but this man had been looking for her. She wanted answers for herself, now. He drew in a deep breath, then his eyes fluttered open. Deep blue, like Durakan's wings, stared back at her. She dropped her hand, suddenly flustered at his nearness, that she'd been touching his face. She sat back on her heels, cradling her injured arm against her and giving them space to study each other. For a moment, no one spoke. The others might have been too shocked at her use of magic, or maybe they, like her, were waiting to hear what the stranger had to say. He seemed to study every feature of her face, taking it in like a man starved. Then, he finally settled on her eyes. Her entire body screamed at her to look away, but instead, she stared back, feeling oddly stripped and vulnerable before him, despite the fact that he was the one caught and bound. His lips twitched, then the right side of his mouth lifted, like he was laughing at her. Sun's fire. You're not the Daisy I remember. His words brought up images of the daisies wrapped around Durakan's paws, along with the dozens she'd involuntarily grown over the years. The things she'd always tried to keep hidden. And now he teased her with it, like it was some sort of thing they shared. She frowned. I'm Eliana, and I doubt we've ever met. Now, he really did laugh, and with their audience, Eliana regretted reviving him. I taught you to swim, he said, and you showed me where to catch tadpoles in the creek. I carried you around on my back half of every day for almost a year, just because you liked being taller. Your mother cheated on my training, because it gave us more time to play. Mention of her mother finally made the others stir. You knew my mother? I lived with your family for my dedication year. I knew you both, and your father. His smile only grew, still holding a mocking air. You were my Daisy. She stiffened at the familiarity. All his words felt foreign. Iris stepped forward, almost between Eliana and the stranger. That's not possible. I recognize you. You're the Prince of L&S. Her presence gave Eliana space to breathe, to consider his words. It couldn't be possible, could it? She'd been 3 when she left Vendaris, so maybe it was possible, but definitely not likely. Not if he was the Prince of L&S. Her recreant parents wouldn't have brought a member of the royal family to their home, allowing him to befriend their daughter. Iris? He shifted against the tree to turn toward Iris more, but his bound hands were in the way. You haven't changed a bit, have you? Yes, I'm Karyne, but you knew me as Henry. My parents weren't exactly going to announce to everyone where I was for my dedication year. Iris bent forward, studying the man like an insect she needed to identify. It could be him. He has the name right, but I thought he was a merchant's son from the village. Karyne snorted. I guess my disguise worked. The others started whispering, but Cyrus drew closer to Eliana. I don't like it. Eliana nodded. Silmar would likely have Kendallin examine Karyne next. It shouldn't be difficult for her to verify the truth. But what if he was lying? Her gaze strayed back toward the Islaran gate. What was Kendallin seeing in Duraken's past right now? Were they going to kill him? Someone took the dagger off my belt. You'll want to see it, Karyne said. Although I still have another in each boot, which means you all didn't search me for weapons. Fine job you're all doing protecting Daisy. She bristled at the accusation, unsure if she was offended that he felt she needed protection, or that he was belittling her companions, or that he still called her Daisy. Lukai stepped forward, pulling the daggers out of Karyne's boots before producing a third. There's a design etched in the pommel, Karyne said, wriggling to sit taller and lean forward. Do you see it, Daisy? She started once more at the name, then recoiled from the dagger that Holm tried passing to her. A simple daisy glinted up from the metal, large enough for others in the circle to see and start whispering about it. Do you remember the daisies? His question was almost a whisper, the eagerness on his face suddenly stripping away his years to make him a boy. She took the dagger from Holm, running her thumb over the grooves of the flower. It looked no more familiar to her than anything else in this part of Riston. No. She handed it back to Holm, barely catching the way Karyne's face fell before he could school his features. You chained them together, he murmured, shifting his gaze to the grass at their feet. Wanted me to teach you to make crowns. You made a dozen of them that night while we hid, before you disappeared. He closed his eyes then, and leaned back against the tree. You saw me disappear? Yes. The single word held as much pain as the cries Arvid had wrung from Della. If she had been 3, he had been, 6, 7? In Lorvandus, dedication years for the nobility occurred when a child turned 8. Was it the same here in Vendaris? With his eyes closed, all his features were soft again, and she could imagine him as a boy, trying to protect a toddler. What would it do to a child To witness something like that at 8 years old.
I've been looking everywhere for you.
He held her gaze once more, the sensation unnerving.
To make sure you were safe. Do you feel safe here?
She hesitated, not because she was uncertain about her answer, but because she wasn't sure how he might use it against her. Being with these people is the safest I've ever felt. Hurt flashed in his eyes, but then he gave a short nod.
That's good. I should have known you wouldn't remember. You were so young. I could show you, but I doubt anyone would let me. It's my opposite spoke. I'd have to touch you to give you the memory.
Veldon pushed off the tree he leaned against, shaking his head. Come here, love. Iris pulled on Eliana's arm, even though she was already out of Garen's range of touch. Eliana was opening her mouth to argue that she wanted the memory, when the sound of approaching footsteps made everyone turn toward the Islaren gate once more. She sluggishly pulled her gaze away from Garen, still not sure what to think of him. Kendallin and Silmar approached, the old man hobbling forward with his cane. His skin hadn't regained its color. Knocking out a dragon must have taken everything out of him. It's clear Durakin came here against his will. Kendallin's gaze lingered on Eliana as she announced her assessment to the group. Eliana nodded, grateful that the other woman could see the lies of his past. If there was a way to disagree with Eliana, Kendallin would have managed it, which made the information even more reliable to their companions.
He still killed all those innocents,
Lukai said. As Mavis's puppet. The words slipped out of Eliana's mouth before she could think them through. What if my mother had been on Durakin's back instead of Arvid? What if she'd attacked right alongside him? No one met her eyes. Cyrus shifted beside her, as if he might say something, but even he kept his gaze fixed on the so-called prince. I know what you're all thinking right now. You're not deciding whether to let him live. She stared each of them down, her gaze landing on Silmar. You're deciding how to kill him.
Of course he needs to die,
Garen said. Eliana whipped around to find the stranger staring at her incredulously.
He killed an entire city,
Garen added. All sympathy she might have felt for the tied-up prince vanished.
It doesn't matter if it was on Mavis's orders, he continued. If anything, that's more reason to kill him. What else could she order him to do?
He's branded. It's not his fault.
Branded? By Mavis?
Garen had the nerve to snort. He shook his head.
I shouldn't be surprised that she does blood magic.
Who are you?
Silmar asked.
Prince Garen of L&S.
He said his own title with a mocking lilt, then gave an exaggerated and awkward bow from his seat on the ground. We can deal with him, Eliana started, but Silmar stepped in front of her.
Lukai, take her.
Silmar's arms spread until his cloak hid Eliana from view. Lukai yanked on Eliana's arm, but she shook him off. Stop being ridiculous. He came to protect me.
Is that so?
Silmar asked.
Then why do his parents have a reward out on your head?
I hope you enjoyed listening to the latest installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton. If you enjoy listening to this narration, you might enjoy listening to the Finding Fantasy Reads podcast, where Paeter and I narrate fantasy short stories from a variety of authors to help you find your next favorite author. Check it out at findingfantasyreads.com. Thanks so much for listening.